No, we don't need Canada. Those words came out of the US ambassador's mouth on live radio this week. Pete Hoekstra, sitting in a Montreal studio, looked into the microphone and told Canadians that America doesn't need us. Now, I want you to remember that sentence because while he was saying it, Prime Minister Mark Carney was landing in Qatar to meet with one of the richest sovereign wealth funds on earth. And the week before that, he was in Beijing signing a landmark trade deal with China. Here's what Ambassador Hoekstra forgot to mention. 60% of America's imported crude oil flows through Canadian pipelines. A third of the uranium powering U.S. nuclear plants comes from Canadian mines, and the electricity keeping the lights on in New York and New England, much of it runs through Canadian power lines. This man said they don't need us. Let me show you what happened next. If you want to see these shifts before they hit the news, subscribe and hit the bell. Let me paint the picture of what Ambassador Hoekstra dismissed with 5 words. The United States imports crude oil from dozens of countries. Canada supplies 60% of it, not 10%, not 20%, 60%. And here's the detail that makes this permanent. Many American refineries, especially in the Midwest and Gulf Coast, were specifically built to process heavy crude from Canadian oil sands. They can't just switch to Saudi light crude overnight. The infrastructure doesn't work that way. Now add natural gas. Canada supplies close to 100% of American natural gas imports. 100%. Then there's uranium, the fuel that keeps American nuclear plants running. In 2024, a third of all uranium purchased by U.S. reactors came from Canada. That's not a trade relationship. That's a supply chain dependency. And electricity, New England and New York import billions of dollars worth of Canadian hydropower every year. Those transmission lines crossing the border, 86 international power lines connecting our grids, they weren't built as a favor. They were built because American states needed the power and Canada had it. This is the country Pete Hoekstra said America doesn't need. But here's the part that should concern Washington. While Hoekstra was giving that interview, Carney wasn't sitting still. He was in China finalizing a deal that cuts tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles from 100% to just 6%, up to 49,000 EVs annually. The same vehicles America slapped with 100% tariffs now flowing into the Canadian market. And then he flew to Qatar, the first sitting Canadian Prime Minister to ever visit that country. And he didn't come back with a handshake. He came back with commitments for significant strategic investments in Canadian infrastructure. That's what happened the same week Hoekstra said those words. And there's a reason Carney moved that fast. January 14th, Montreal, CJAD 800 radio, host Elias Makos asks Ambassador Hoekstra about Trump's comments that America could easily replace Canadian products. Hoekstra doesn't hedge. He doesn't soften. He says it directly. No, we don't need Canada. 3 days later, Carney lands in Beijing. Canada hadn't sent a prime minister to China in nearly a decade. Relations had been frozen. Diplomats expelled. The relationship was as cold as it gets between two major economies. And in one visit, Carney walked away with a landmark deal. Chinese tariffs on Canadian canola, which had been at 85%, dropped to 15%. Canadian tariffs on Chinese EVs dropped from 100% to 6%. Both countries committed to exploring energy cooperation. 10 years of ice melted in a week. Think about that timeline for a second. The day after Beijing, Carney flew to Doha, Qatar, first Canadian Prime Minister in history to visit. He met with the Amir, Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, and secured commitments for what the government called significant strategic investments in Canadian infrastructure. Not exploratory talks, not maybe someday discussions, signed commitments for capital that will flow into Canadian projects. Now here's the number buried in all of this that nobody's talking about. Qatar's sovereign wealth fund manages over $500 billion. That's the kind of capital that builds LNG terminals, that builds pipelines, that builds the infrastructure Canada needs to ship resources to Asia instead of south. And this is where Hoekstra's statement becomes a strategic mistake, because what he said on that radio wasn't strength, it was a tell. Here's the rule: powerful countries don't explain themselves, they don't reassure themselves out loud. Confidence doesn't announce itself. The moment you have to say you don't need someone, you've already admitted you're worried that you might. Every investor watching heard that signal. Every trade negotiator registered it. Every foreign ministry in the Middle East, in Asia, in Europe. They all understood what it meant. Canada isn't begging anymore, and Washington just confirmed it noticed. Let me show you what's already happening on the ground. LNG Canada in British Columbia, $40 billion, the largest energy infrastructure project in Canadian history. First cargo shipped last June. Over 25 shipments since then, all going to Asia. That terminal isn't a proposal, it's concrete and steel. It's already operating. And there are 3 more LNG projects under construction or approved. Cedar LNG, Woodfibre LNG, a potential Phase 2 expansion that would double LNG Canada's capacity. This is what infrastructure diversification looks like when it's real. Not announcements, not promises, shipments. Meanwhile, the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion came online in 2024, nearly tripling Canada's capacity to ship oil to Pacific markets. Canadian crude is now flowing to South Korea, to Japan, to India, markets that used to be unreachable. Here's why this doesn't reverse. Pipelines don't reroute back because someone asks nicely. Terminals don't relocate. Trade routes don't flip because an ambassador gives a different interview next month. Once infrastructure is built, pointing in a new direction, that's the direction resources flow. For decades, the investment agreements Carney signed in Qatar and China, those aren't handshakes. Those are legal frameworks with timelines, with capital commitments, with penalty clauses. They're designed to be permanent. And here's what should really concern Washington. Canada isn't just building an exit for itself. It's showing every middle power in the world how to do it. Right now, Mexico is watching. Australia is watching. The Europeans are watching. They're all asking the same question. If Canada can diversify without getting crushed, why can't we? That's the real damage. Not what Canada gains, but what America loses when the assumption of loyalty disappears. For 70 years, the American system ran on one bet. Allies don't actually build alternatives. Canada just proved that bet is off. If you think more Canadians need to understand what just shifted, hit that like button. The algorithm listens. So here's where we are. Pete Hoekstra said America doesn't need Canada. The same week, Canada proved it doesn't need America's permission anymore. Chinese EVs flowing through the border at 6% tariffs. Qatari billions committed to Canadian infrastructure. A $40 billion LNG terminal already shipping gas to Asia. And the U.S. response? A defensive radio interview that revealed more anxiety than strength. The old game was whoever sounds tougher wins. The new game is whoever has more options doesn't need to say anything at all. Canada figured that out. Carney isn't threatening. He isn't posturing. He's quietly building a position where Hoekstra's opinion doesn't matter. By the time Washington realizes what happened, the ports will be built, the contracts will be signed, the pipelines will be flowing in a different direction. My question for you, do you think America wakes up to this before it's too late? Or does the diversification become permanent? Drop your answer below. I'm reading every comment. They said we couldn't survive without American trade. We didn't just survive, we started building a new network. And that network gets bigger every week. If you want to understand how this trade relationship got so broken, the moment Trump called Canada the 51st state and what Carney said in response, that video explains why Australia, Qatar, and China all said yes so fast. It's the context for everything you just watched. That video is right here. I'll see you there.